Ever heard that saying, never start a fight you can't finish?
Hmm. Interesting.
Well, today's deep dive
Oh,
is all about a time America might forgotten that memo. The War of 1812.
oh, okay.
You know, the one with the Star-Spangled Banner.
Right, right.
And not a whole lot else ringing a bell.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
We're going to unpack a stack of sources,
Okay.
a scholarly article dissecting the war's public memory,
Right.
2 History News Network opinion pieces,
Okay.
going head-to-head on whether it was a win at all,
Okay.
and a textbook section setting the scene for America's early 1800s world tour.
All right.
Get ready,
Okay.
because we're diving into how this war shaped America's identity, for better and worse,
Okay.
and why it's both celebrated
Oh,
and
sure.
strangely forgotten.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What's fascinating here is that right from the outset,
Yeah.
the whole narrative around the War of 1812 was caught in a tug of war.
Okay, let's unpack that.
Sure.
We're talking about how it gets called America's Second War of Independence, right?
That's exactly.
Okay.
One of our sources, historian Matthew Dennis, points out this label.
Okay.
While a good story never really stuck with the public, that the powers that be, they sure tried to make it stick.
Why so hard?
Well,
What was the strategy behind that?
imagine
Okay.
Washington, D.C. burned to the ground,
Yeah.
the British back on American soil.
Right.
Those events stirred up old revolutionary anxieties and resentments.
Uh-huh.
It's no coincidence that the ruling party, the
Okay.
Democratic Republicans,
Mm-hmm.
used this narrative to their advantage.
Yeah.
By painting the war as a victory, as a defense of American ideals,
Right.
they strengthened their own position and tapped into a rising tide of nationalism sweeping the nation.
Talk about a power play.
Yeah.
But was it really a victory?
Mm.
Because our sources don't exactly agree on that.
Right, and that's the heart of it. The
Yeah.
Treaty of Ghent,
Mhm.
which officially ended the war,
Okay.
didn't grant any real concessions to either side. So framing the war as a decisive American victory,
Uh-huh.
well, it required some creative storytelling, wouldn't you say?
A little historical spin doctoring never hurt anyone, right?
Perhaps.
Yeah.
But it had a lasting impact.
How so?
It fed into this notion of American exceptionalism.
Okay.
The idea that the U.S. is destined for greatness, always in the right, always triumphant.
Right.
And as you can imagine, that kind of thinking can be a dangerous foundation for foreign policy.
A recipe for overconfidence, maybe.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And we see this play out throughout American history.
Yes.
While the War of 1812 was relatively small in scale,
Uh-huh.
it planted the seeds for a certain type of American militarism,
Okay.
one that often downplayed the costs and complexities of war.
Right. And to complicate matters.
Yeah.
This new nationalism
Mhm.
wasn't exactly a unifying force for everyone, right?
Exactly.
Oh,
Our
like-
sources point out how differently this played out across the country.
Yeah.
The war, in some ways,
Uh-huh.
exposed existing fractures,
Okay.
particularly around westward expansion,
Right.
and of course, the deeply divisive issue of slavery.
Right. And if we're talking about those fault lines,
Yeah,
we have to talk about how the War of 1812 affected Native Americans.
absolutely.
It wasn't pretty.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
The war further marginalized Native American tribes,
Right.
leading to further displacement and dispossession of their lands.
Yeah.
This, in turn, fueled westward expansion,
Right.
which, as we mentioned, was intricately tied to the expansion of slavery.
Right.
So while you have this surge of national pride and a push for unity on one hand,
Uh-huh.
you have the seeds of future conflict being sown on the other.
Yeah, I see what you mean. So we're seeing how this messy war full of contradictions
Yeah.
gets smoothed over into a narrative of American triumph.
Yeah.
But what about the individual stories?
Mm,
The people who lived through it?
right.
Our sources delve into that too.
And that's where things get really interesting. Because while the War of 1812 did launch certain figures into the national spotlight,
Mhm.
it also relegated countless others to the footnotes of history.
It's like everyone remembers George Washington crossing the Delaware,
Right.
but who remembers the poor guy who rowed the boat?
A perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And in the case of the War of 1812,
Right.
those overshadowed figures include not just ordinary soldiers,
Yeah.
but also some fascinating characters who deserve to be better known.
Give me an example.
Okay.
Who are we missing out on?
Well, there's Hiram Cronk, for instance.
Okay.
He lived to the ripe old age of 105
Wow.
and became a national celebrity as the last surviving veteran of the war.
Wow, a living link to history.
Right.
What a story he must have had.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But his personal experiences, the
Mm.
realities of what he witnessed during the war,
Right.
those often got lost in all the fanfare.
Yeah.
Kronk was presented as a symbol of longevity,
Right.
a relic of a bygone era.
Right.
But the nuances of his individual story, like many others, became secondary to the larger narrative.
And it's not just about individual soldiers.
Yeah.
Right. We were talking about how the war deepened existing divisions in American society.
Precisely.
Okay.
And one of the sources brings up a really poignant example,
Okay.
the story of Peter Peterson.
Mm-hmm.
He was a black man who fought in the War of 1812,
Okay.
despite having been born into slavery.
Hold on. A black soldier fighting for a nation that still allowed slavery.
Yeah.
That's incredibly poignant, as you said.
It is.
Yeah.
It highlights the complexities of the time
Right.
and challenges this simplistic idea we often have of the past.
Right.
Here's a man fighting for a nation that didn't afford him full citizenship,
Right.
fighting alongside people who might have even owned slaves themselves.
Wow.
Yeah.
It makes you think about whose stories get told,
Mm-hmm.
whose sacrifices get remembered, and whose experiences are often erased from the official narrative.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that's why these deep dives are so important. Right.
By digging into these lesser-known stories,
Yeah.
we get a much richer, albeit more complicated understanding of the past.
Speaking of complicated,
Yes.
we touched on how the War of 1812 was used to bolster Andrew Jackson's political career.
Uh-huh.
But wasn't he a bit of a controversial figure even back then?
To say the least.
Yeah.
While the war propelled him to national prominence,
Right.
his legacy is deeply entwined with the tragic displacement and mistreatment of Native Americans,
You're talking about the Trail of Tears?
among other things.
Yeah.
And it all ties back to that narrative of American expansionism that the War of 1812 helped solidify.
Right.
The acquisition of Native American lands,
Mm-hmm.
fueled by this sense of manifest destiny,
Right.
had devastating consequences.
It's like this one war,
Yeah,
this second war of independence that wasn't really a clean victory,
right.
ends up casting this long shadow over so much of American history.
And it's not just about the events themselves,
Okay.
but also about how those events were remembered, reshaped.
And sometimes conveniently forgotten.
Right. Like with the monument.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Take the case of Oliver Hazard Perry,
Okay.
a naval hero of the war.
Mm-hmm.
There was a monument dedicated to him in Cleveland, Ohio.
Wait, I think I read about this.
Yeah.
What happened?
It was torn down to make way for a Civil War memorial.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
While this might seem like a simple matter of city planning,
Right.
it speaks volumes about shifting priorities in public memory.
Exactly.
So certain historical events,
Mm-hmm.
even if significant at the time,
Yeah.
can end up overshadowed by others.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that raises some interesting questions about how we decide which stories get told and retold
Mm-hmm.
and which ones fade into the background.
It's like we're constantly rewriting history,
Yeah.
even without realizing it.
And in the case of the War of 1812, that rewriting has taken some rather surprising turns, particularly in recent years.
Okay, so we've talked about how the War of 1812 has been reshaped
Right.
and sometimes even erased from public memory. Yeah. But our sources suggest it hasn't totally faded into obscurity, right?
Right.
There are still these weird,
Yeah.
unexpected ways it pops up today.
That's right, for example.
Okay?
Did you know that in some towns in Connecticut,
Yeah.
they hold annual festivals
Oh.
commemorating their losses during the war?
Celebrating defeat.
I know, right?
That's a new one.
Yeah.
Why would they do that?
It's a fascinating example
What's
of
that?
how communities reinterpret their own past. These festivals aren't about glorifying defeat,
Right.
but rather about acknowledging their history,
Yeah.
warts and all,
Uh-huh.
with a sense of irony and even humor.
So it's like saying,
Yeah.
hey, we took one for the team and we're still here to tell the tale.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it highlights
Okay.
how even seemingly insignificant events can take on a life of their own in local memory,
Right.
often challenging the grand narratives we find in textbooks.
It's a good reminder that history isn't just something that happened in the past. Right.
It's something we actively shape and reshape through how we choose to remember it.
Absolutely.
Right.
And sometimes that reshaping involves a healthy dose of commercialism.
Huh?
The bicentennial of the War of 1812,
Yeah.
back in 2012,
Mm-hmm.
saw a surge in all sorts of let's say, creative interpretations.
What, like War of 1812 commemorative plates?
You name it.
Okay.
There were tall ship festivals, museum exhibits,
Right.
even an American Girl doll inspired by the era.
Wow.
Yeah.
Really?
It's a reminder that even a forgotten war can become a commodity packaged and sold to contemporary audiences.
Which brings us to perhaps the most enduring legacy of the War of 1812.
Okay.
The Star-Spangled Banner.
Right.
Everyone knows the song,
Right.
but how many people know it was inspired by a war?
Right.
Most Americans have basically forgotten.
It's ironic, isn't it?
Yeah.
And even the song itself has a more complicated history than people realize.
Okay.
It was actually based on a British drinking song.
Wait, seriously? Yeah.
Our national anthem has roots in a British pub song.
It's true.
Wow.
And let's not forget those often omitted verses, the ones about washing out footsteps with blood.
Right.
Not exactly the most unifying message.
Talk about awkward family reunions with our British cousins.
I know, right?
Yeah.
But that's the thing about history.
Okay.
It's full of these unexpected connections and contradictions, and the Star-Spangled Banner, for all its complexities, has become this powerful symbol of American identity, even if its origins are a bit more, shall we say, muddled than we like to admit.
So as we resurface from this deep dive into the War of 1812,
Yeah.
what have we learned?
Mm-hmm.
It's a story of messy battles, political maneuvering,
Right.
and a whole lot of historical spin. But it's also a story about the power of narrative,
Yeah.
the ways we remember and forget,
Right.
and the surprising ways the past continues to shape our present.
Absolutely.
If this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, we encourage you to explore further.
Yes.
Read those sources,
Right.
question the narratives,
Absolutely.
and discover for yourself the hidden stories of the War of 1812.
Yeah.
A war that, despite its often forgotten status, has left an undeniable mark on America's identity and place in the world.
I totally agree.